again for coming.
Good evening. You don't want a presentation from me. So, but this is our fifth ward meeting, right? Is that right? No, I think we got 5 under our belt. So, but as usual, West Newton has done a great job getting the word out, which is terrific. You've got great representatives here. So we're going to throw a lot of information at you tonight. I guess what I want to leave you with is this is not the only opportunity that you have to kind of absorb this and put your questions together. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible tonight, and hopefully we can clear up some things in the presentation. So I just want to recognize the staff from my team that's here. There are some folks out front that were checking you in, Janet and Noreen and Claire and Alice. You're going to hear from James Fries, who's the Deputy Director, Rachel Ned Carney, who's our long-range planner, Lily Canon Reynolds. I think most of you have seen Lily at our meetings in the past. This reminds me of a meeting we had on the West Newton Square improvements, which, believe it or not, is out to bid, which is pretty exciting, I think. So hopefully we'll have good news on that soon. So without further ado, I think my job is to introduce James, who will talk. Lily, see, I already screwed up. See that? See how easy it is? So here's Lily to tell us what we have in front of us tonight.
Hi, good evening. So I'm going to hand things over to James in a minute. I do just want to emphasize what Barney said about upcoming meetings. So Rachel will show those slides in a second, but there's one that's not on the slide, which is a meeting that we're planning on February 27th. So I'll write that up on this white paper in a minute. And that's a West Newton sort of oriented meeting that will further describe these 2 different projects that we have going on, the Washington Street vision plan and zoning redesign. So that's upcoming, and it will be at the Franklin School. Yes, so what we like to do when we come out to the community and have a bunch of neighbors in the room is to kick things off just with an opportunity for us to turn to the person next to you and introduce yourself, maybe meet somebody new and why you're here tonight, and we'll get started in about 60 seconds.
Keith. Julia Malachi, hi, nice to meet you.
Julia.
Where do you live?
North Street.
Okay, I'm familiar with North Street. We just planted some trees there, Newton Tree Conservancy trees, near Joseph Road. Joseph Road
okay.
And North Street, yeah. And I am. Yes, trees. You're going to announce that, yeah, okay.
Why are you recording?
Facebook Live.
Like for the city?
No, I'm just recording it for me.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, we're kind of Facebook Live. You have to be on Facebook to watch it, but most people are not on Facebook. They have a friend on Facebook. Have you been to any of these?
Nope.
Okay.
This is one of my first. I went to the
Did you go to Washington?
Greenville Area Council.
Okay. Oh, the one at the library.
Yes.
Yes. That was good.
And then I was at the
Okay, good evening, everybody. Good evening.
Yeah.
I know we could keep doing this all night,
Okay.
but I thought we might go ahead and move on to the presentation. Good evening. My name is Steve. Anyone, maybe just the front of the room wants to do the presentation. You can just do the front. All right, we're going to get started. Before I get started, I just wanted to note that this meeting is being recorded. I hope everyone got that. This meeting is being recorded. Good? You can't hear in the back? Can you hear in the back?
Lift up the mic.
Can you hear me now? Ah, there we go. Okay, right up against me. All right, so just noting again, this meeting is being recorded tonight, so everybody knows. So, thanks everyone for coming. Welcome again. My name again is James Fries, Deputy Director of Planning, and we're here tonight to talk about the zoning redesign project. So tonight we're just a brief agenda. We're going to talk about objective for the meeting this evening. We're talking a little bit of background, and then spend some time walking through the ordinance and a couple case studies and details of what's in it. So 3 primary objectives here. One that we're adding for this particular meeting is the fact that we want to spend a little time clarifying the differences between this project, which is the rewrite of the zoning ordinance for the entire city, as opposed to the Washington Street project, which many of you may be familiar with, which is a visioning project looking strictly at Washington Street corridor from West Newton all the way through and inclusive of the Craft Street area that also includes zoning. We're also going to provide an overview and orientation to the first draft ordinance, zoning ordinance, and I want to emphasize some of those words. First draft. We released this draft on October 22nd, and we're aiming for a second draft and ultimately probably a third draft before this thing is all said and done. And then, of course, we see tonight as the start of a discussion about this draft ordinance, this first draft ordinance, that's going to really extend for a pretty long period of time as we get into the details with you, with our city councilors, and with many other stakeholders. So, the zoning redesign project, citywide project to create a better baseline zoning ordinance. So I'll be talking about that to a much greater extent this evening. But this effort, the zoning redesign effort, is based first and foremost on the city as it exists today. Washington Street is a discussion around the future of the Washington Street corridor. Again, West Newton to roughly the Craft Street area. The result of that project is going to be a vision plan just for that area and zoning specific to that area. So for this project, we're looking citywide, new zoning map for the entire city. That process is just looking at a new zoning map within the boundaries of that study area, which we will show again in a moment. For the Washington Street project, and this is probably the last I'm going to mention the Washington Street project, we have a couple upcoming meetings. This Monday, the Zoning and Planning Committee will be taking up, continuing a conversation on that project. And then February 11th at City Hall, there's going to be a presentation and the release of the second draft of the vision plan, including a draft of the proposed zoning. And then, as Lily mentioned before, there's going to be a meeting on February 27th at the Franklin School. I believe primarily on the Washington Street corridor plan, but also zoning redesign. All right. So how will these projects sync up? The Washington Street zoning in particular will presumably be adopted by the City Council before we complete the zoning redesign project. And so it'll be adopted as a section in the current zoning ordinance. Assuming it is adopted, though, we will begin integrating it into the draft of the citywide zoning so that when that is adopted at some point in the future, the two will be incorporated together. So, to come back to zoning redesign, a little background. First off, zoning, what is zoning? Zoning is the regulation of the built environment, the types of buildings, their locations, how they relate to each other, how they relate to the public realm of the street, etc., and the uses of those buildings. A zoning ordinance includes many features. It includes a zoning map, which lays out the districts that the city is divided up into, residential districts, commercial districts, etc. And then there's a zoning ordinance itself, which provides the text and the rules that apply within those districts for the development, for buildings, etc. Amongst those rules are dimensional requirements. These are the standards that apply to people's properties, the setbacks, the heights, basically defining how big a building can be and where it can be located. And then there's the standards that deal with how a property can be developed, things like parking standards, sign standards, and then standards tied to particular uses. And then finally, there's a decision-making process. Every zoning ordinance includes some form of decision-making process that includes things like special permits, variances from the zoning ordinance, etc. So Newton actually has a long history with zoning. Zoning was first introduced into the United States in 1916, and in 1922, Newton had a zoning ordinance. In fact, we imported the same guy who wrote Manhattan's zoning ordinance to do ours. In 1941, That's when Newton actually first introduced things like minimum lot sizes, setbacks, and those types of things. And then again in 1953, we increased all of those requirements. The last real significant reorganization or update of the zoning ordinance occurred in 1987, focusing mostly on the commercial zones. In 2011, the zoning reform group was formed by the city council and issued a report basically identifying why the city might need to pursue a development of a new zoning ordinance. First phase of that work was completed in 2015, was simply a reorganization and update to the formatting of the ordinance. But the real work of revising the zoning ordinance began in 2016 and continued all the way up through and inclusive of today. So that 2011 report in many ways laid out the program for this project, identifying a significant number of goals. I'm not going to read this entire list, but it included things like rationalizing and streamlining parking regulations, addressing environmental requirements, improving kind of sustainability, if you will, of the zoning ordinance, protecting neighborhood character, but allowing for diverse housing options. We took these marching orders and we from that, in the planning department, developed the idea of doing what we called a context-based zoning ordinance. And what we meant by that was that the rules of this ordinance would be derived from the existing context of the city, the existing conditions on the ground, or the desired conditions where those have been defined by some form of adopted city policy or plan. And there were three main ideas that we were thinking of when we came up with this idea of a context-based ordinance. One was a recognition that Newton is already a great place. It's a place that people love. It's a place that has really incredible places within it. And so that a zoning ordinance that was based on those attributes of the city made sense. That was the right way to go. In addition, Newton's form of development, the patterns of development across the city, village centers, walkable village centers centered around transit, with walkable neighborhoods adjacent, is actually considered in modern planning practice to be a highly sustainable approach to laying out a city. And so by virtue of doing a context-based ordinance, we were also making a zoning ordinance that was inherently more sustainable in its prescriptions for the city. And then finally, in this ordinance, we're really leaning heavily on that existing context, on the existing city, with the idea that future planning efforts will look at where more significant change might be warranted and therefore should be reflected in zoning. So efforts like the Washington Street study, efforts like a recent work the city did on Needham Street, those efforts will really dig into the conversations, the discussions, the analysis that's necessary to really think about planning for change, and zoning will result from that. But this larger project is going to focus on creating a better baseline zoning ordinance that reflects the existing conditions of the city. So to do a context-based zoning ordinance, the first thing you have to do is really understand what you got. And there'd never really been a comprehensive analysis and inventory of the city as it exists today. So we did that with what we call the pattern book, which is a snapshot in time of those patterns of development, the buildings in the city, the lots in the city, what their characteristics are. And we developed this incredible inventory of that data that we then used to shape the standards and the rules in the draft ordinance. So this book is actually available online and really represents an incredible resource of maps and tables and information about the city for those who may be interested. Over the course of 2017 and the first half of 2018, we did an event series, one meeting a month, each one focusing on a topic area that touches on the zoning ordinance, ranging from issues of sustainability, housing, economic development, and transportation. And each one of these meetings featured a presentation that showed some ideas, some things that we could do within the zoning ordinance, and then opportunities for discussion and feedback on those ideas. This process was immensely helpful as we then started drafting the ordinance, which we did over the course beginning last summer and into this past fall. So the starting point for setting the standards that are in the draft ordinance was, again, the existing patterns of development in the city, the pattern book itself. with a recognition that the standards and the numbers, if you will, that we put out in this draft ordinance represent a starting point for this conversation that we're having here tonight, and we anticipate continuing to have over the course of the next many months. So this is our opportunity to take those existing numbers that reflect existing conditions and refine them and think about the direction for the future. And of course, as with any legislative work, which this is, there's a challenge of balancing competing interests. What are those competing interests? Things like property rights, the ability for someone to do reasonable expansions on their homes, but we also know the flip side of that is the issue of teardowns and replacement of homes with significantly larger homes, which we know has been a major issue across the city, something we've heard a lot about. There's issues of property values, tax revenue, and then ultimately the larger issue of neighborhood character and how cities, neighborhoods, places evolve over time as a reflection of changing conditions. So I'm going to do a little guide to reading the draft ordinance. Some ideas to think about as you start to dig into the draft ordinance yourself. First off is the idea of separating mechanisms from standards. So it's actually kind of an important thing to do is to understand that a mechanism is a tool. It's something like a setback. It's a height limit. It's a range of things, and we'll touch on many of them. The standard itself, though, is the number applied to that. So if the mechanism is the front setback, the standard is it's 20 feet. And it's important to make that distinction, particularly as we get into some of the more complex mechanisms within the ordinance. It's also important to remember that all the rules apply comprehensively, not selectively. You don't just get to apply the setback, the one setback, but not the other one. You don't get to just apply setbacks and not lot coverage. All of them apply all at once, and when they all apply together, that's when we see the results that we're aiming for in this ordinance. Finally, one of the things we're aiming for is a degree of simplicity. No math more complicated than addition and subtraction, right? And that is no knock on anyone's intelligence. It's simply saying that when you get into more complicated math, you get into more opportunities for challenges in interpretation of the ordinance or in how people apply it to their properties. And related to that is the idea of measuring simply. Try and use simple measurements that everyone can understand, that everyone can even verify themselves. So the ordinance has, first draft ordinance has 12 articles. I'm going to go into these in a little more detail, but some of the important ones to highlight here. The Article 2 is general standards. That one provides kind of the rules of the game. That one's where we define what a setback is and how you measure it. The district standards, these are each of the districts, the residential districts, the village districts, etc., are defined in Articles 3 through 7. Development standards show up in Article 8, use standards in Article 9. The rules for administration, all those decision-making processes show up in Article 10 for non-conforming properties and in Article 11 for everybody else. And finally, the definitions are in Article 12. So in the districts, the standards that apply in each district, this is where you're going to find your lot and setback standards, rules like frontage requirements, setbacks, lot coverage, and then the allowed building types. These are the rules that kind of define the nature of the district, how it presents to the street, what it feels like to be in that district to somebody walking down the street. The building types kind of collect into one place all the dimensional standards that apply to the buildings. So here's where you're going to find the footprint, which basically is your defining characteristic for how big a building can be, that coupled with height, and then specific rules that apply to specific building types, such as rules around fenestration, which is basically the percentage of a frontage that it's windows and doors. The Article 8 has the development standards. This is where you're going to find your parking requirements and the design for parking, the parking design requirements, your stormwater management requirements. Sign rules are in here as well, but also some new sections that deal with sustainable design of buildings and lots. So how do we make a more environmentally friendly city, at least for new development over time? Then the use standards are in Article 9. These are the standards that apply to particular uses. So an example here A brewery is a new use that we're proposing within the first draft of the ordinance, and then it has criteria attached to it. So if one wanted to open a brewery, they would have to meet the criteria that are identified here in the ordinance. Similarly, for manufacturing, there's very clear criteria within the ordinance around nuisance prevention, odors, noise, etc. So I'm going to dive into the draft map. One of the key starting points for us, though, in developing the map was understanding that today the city is 87% non-conforming with our existing zoning ordinance. So what does that mean? That means that amongst 6 different attributes that we looked at, there's on each one of these 87% of all the lots in the city, in each one of these lots, there's some aspect of the lot that is not consistent with the rules of our current zoning ordinance. Not surprising, given that most of the city was built before most of those rules came into being in 1941. So in making the map, we had some principles, some kind of rules of thumb that we used. Among those was attempting to minimize nonconformity, and the corollary to that, maximize consistency with the patterns of development as evidenced from the work of the pattern book. I'll note, one of the things we did was we excluded from our data set buildings, houses, single-family homes and two-family homes built after the year 2000. This was an attempt to remove what are generally a much larger scale of house than the historic pattern of development in the city from the data set, so that our data wasn't skewed towards the larger end. Other rules that we used is we tried to put, to the extent practical, the boundaries between zoning districts at the rear of properties rather than running down the middle of the street. The idea there is that like should face like. When I look out my window, the houses or the buildings across the street should be similar to the ones that I have. That promotes neighborhood cohesion. The boundaries, we literally, in creating this map, went block by block, analyzing the buildings that are there, the uses that are there, so that we can understand in a fine-grained detail what's there in the city, and then we made the boundaries between districts where there were significant shifts in the pattern of development, which is to say that if we had a row of single-family homes and one two-family home, that didn't shift this over into the multifamily district. It had to be a predominant feature of that block or that street of two-family homes before that area was considered to be in the two-family zoning district. So here's our resulting map. There's a larger version of it in the back. There's also a map in the back that overlays the current zoning map over top of the first draft map, and then there's a detailed map of just Ward 3. So there's 14 total districts proposed within the first draft ordinance. The first set of these, the residence districts and the village districts, are what we call contextual districts. These are the districts that most clearly reflect the predominant pattern of development in the city, the historic pattern of development in the city. The remaining districts in Articles 5 and 6 are our non-contextual districts. These are the districts that represent standalone buildings. Think of the Chestnut Hill Mall, think of Wells Avenue Office Park, think of Chestnut Hill Towers or Nahanton Woods. Each of these are standalone buildings that don't fit within that context of kind of the historic development patterns of the city. They literally are designed to stand apart and stand alone. When we were constructing the maps, particularly for the village centers, we developed 3 village districts, Village 1 through 3. And they're designed, again, to reflect that existing pattern of development where the highest intensity buildings are roughly at the center of our village districts. And then the intensity of building, generally measured in height, steps down from there until it meets up with the surrounding residential neighborhoods. So this is an image of Newton Corner. And in Newton Corner, you have at the very center the Village 3 district, which is our highest intensity district. And then it steps down from there into the Village 2 and Village 1 and then into the neighborhood. Excuse me. Newton Center, by contrast, doesn't have buildings of the same scale as Newton Corner. It's a very different place. And so the highest intensity district in Newton Center is the Village 2 district, and that, of course, is also at the center of Newton Center. And then it steps down to the Village 1 and then to the neighborhoods from there. Now, as I said, the vast majority of the map, the vast majority of this ordinance reflects the existing city, the existing context, but there's a handful of exceptions to that rule. One of those is Needham Street, where last spring the city completed a visioning process. And so the zoning we're proposing there, and what shows up on the first draft zoning map, is zoning districts reflective of the results of that visioning work. On Washington Street, for the time being, we've just outlined on our draft map the study area of Washington Street. What's inside of that map for right now on our map reflects the existing conditions, existing context. But we're marking that out for the future. And then finally, the other special case is the Riverside site, the end of the MBTA Green Line. We, as a placeholder, have put that in the Village 3 district, recognizing that that's the district that most closely resembles the previously approved special permit. But we're kind of in a wait-and-see mode to see what the visioning process for Riverside produces and ultimately what the Land Use Committee of City Council decides relative to this property. And then we'll make a decision about an appropriate zoning district there. So, at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Rachel to do some case studies of the zoning ordinance.
All right. Can everyone still hear me in the back? Good. So we've done through this, we're doing a few case studies, and I want to talk through some of the key features that these case studies show. So as we jump into this, the first big one here is the relationship between lot size and building size. The relationship between lot size and building size in the first draft ordinance is different than in the in our current ordinance. We want to show you how it works. So, you think this is a typical street in Newton, lot sizes are about the same, building sizes are about the same. On the other side of the street, you get an interesting thing happening. You have a double lot. This happens all over the place, where you have two lots that were formed together. Under our current ordinance, lot size dictates building size. The larger your lot, the larger your building, which means that the double lot gets a double-sized building. It also means that if you have an odd-shaped lot and you have extra land in the back, you get extra building space. So this one in the middle gets to be larger because they have extra land, even though it has the same frontage and same pattern as the neighbors that are smaller. This is a project that was constructed using a lot that has an odd shape. This is a by right project. They get to build a larger house because of the land in the back, even though the pattern of this neighborhood is smaller homes. Under the first draft ordinance, what we're looking at is building types first. As James was explaining, the building types collect all of the dimensional controls. So we have 4 different house types. Before I get into this one, we have 4 different house types. If you're looking at your sheet, we have a house A, house B, house C, and house D. And each of those has its own rules associated with it. House A is your largest. It's not allowed in all districts. House B is our most typical house in Newton. House C is a small house, 1.5 stories maximum. And house D is a 1-story maximum. They aren't allowed, the house D is not allowed to go above 1 story, but it's allowed a little bit more ground plane. So what I want to show you are 3 case studies. These are all chosen because they had recently been through the special permit process at the City Council. So they'd already been analyzed against the current ordinance. So that's why we picked them. And they show different things. So this first one is a case that was a teardown in 2010. They recently came back in 2018 for a small addition on the back. This is how it was analyzed. You can see the house pre-2010 at the top left and post-2010 on the right. We analyzed it then against the current ordinance standards. Highlighted or in red are the things that are problematic. And that project would need some substantial changes under the first draft ordinance today. So, some key features that this case study shows us. First is the contextual front setback. The rule of a contextual front setback is something in our ordinance today, but it's voluntary, it's not the primary. So under the first draft ordinance, we have the contextual front setback first, which means that you take your front setback off of the 2 neighbors. In this particular case, the house on the left is set exactly at 25 feet, and the house on the right is set at 25 feet. So we would look for the house in the middle to be in line with its neighbors up here at this red line. Next is footprint size. The largest house type that's allowed in the R2 district, which is what Beethoven Street would be in, is the house B. The largest by right footprint for house B is 1,600 square feet. That's what that looks like in comparison to the house that was constructed. By special permit, it would be allowed to go a little bigger, 600 square foot additional footprint, but the rest would never have been allowed to be built.
How did they get it built?
The house was built under current ordinance.
So, can you just go back? I'm sorry. You're saying that that lot can only have a 1,600, how
Correct.
big is that lot?
We'll come back to it. The lot.
This isn't making sense.
Yep, the lot size again. So we're going to come back to lots of time for questions. So we can come back to any of these slides. But lot size, as I was saying in the beginning, lot size does not dictate building size. Context dictates building size. So the largest house that would be allowed in that Residence 2 district is the house B, which is a by right footprint of 1,600 square feet and 2.5 stories.
4,000 square feet.
4,000.
So again, I'm going to come back to questions at the end, all right? So
Old zoning code.
So next thing that this case shows us is lot coverage. Again, this is the house that was built in 2010. Shown here are all the features that would be considered under our new definition of lot coverage. The lot coverage number that you see in the current ordinance and the lot coverage number you see in the first draft ordinance are not the same definition. That's why the numbers are so disparate. Under the first draft ordinance, lot coverage would include a lot more things. It would include the house, any outbuildings like a shed, decks, driveways, walkways, etc. Anything that's not open to the ground. And the number is larger to reflect that. Next is garage placement. The first draft ordinance has some rules around garages. First one is that it has to be no more than 50% of the width of the front of the house. And second is that it needs to be in line with the front of the house. We are still playing with this rule and many others. We are getting feedback on them actively. One of the things that we're still considering is if instead of that line being where that dashed line is shown, it should be in line with that front portico that we saw in the picture. The next case is 307 Lexington Street. This is a case that had 2 lots. You can see at the top there, we've got a house on the left and a vacant lot on the right. That lot was a vacant lot, and as part of this project, they combined the lots together. So it's a 2-family house. They got a special permit to do an addition and expand that non-conforming 2-unit nature. The proposal would require changes under the first draft as well. This is the house plan that was shown, that was approved. The existing house stays. There's a nice addition. And here you can see that lot layout. So when they started this project, there were 2 lots. There's the lot with the house and the lot in the middle. This is the project that was approved. It did benefit from some really good architecture that highlighted the main house. But it could have turned out a different way. It could have ended up as a teardown with a replacement of a much larger size. With the first draft ordinance, they have a few options. If they had left it the same if they had combined the lots as they did under the current ordinance, they could have done an addition, but it would have been smaller. The size of a 2-family is again based on the sizes of 2 families across Newton, and is a smaller size. It's capped at a 2,200 square foot footprint. And the proposal that was approved was 2,900. They also could have left the lot. Under the first draft ordinance, this becomes a conforming lot where they could have done a new infill construction, leaving the original house intact. The third case goes through a courtyard cluster. These are starting to become more common. The nearest one to Newton is Concord Riverwalk in West Concord. What it is sort of it's an alternative to a townhouse, where you have 1 or 2 family homes that are separate detached structures surrounding a common courtyard. So I want to show you a case of a lot that was constructed as townhouses under the current ordinance, would not be allowed to be constructed as townhouses under the proposed, but could have done a special permit for this courtyard cluster idea. So here you see the two comparisons of the charts. And again, the project that they got approved for, which was townhouses, would not be approvable under the first draft ordinance, so they would need to do something different. With the courtyard cluster, I want to walk you through how that would play out here. And again, so the courtyard cluster is a special permit case. This is the layout of those townhouses. In total, it was 9 townhouse units. Each one had a footprint of 1,300 to 1,500 square feet. Under the courtyard cluster, you start with the lot and the setbacks. So the combined lot, here you can see the setbacks. Just like with that first case study we looked at, there's the contextual front setback, that's that zone in yellow. And then you add the courtyard. The courtyard cluster comes with a requirement that each unit has to have 400 square feet or more in the courtyard. So you size your courtyard based on the number of units. So depending on how many units you want, you need a bigger courtyard. Next, you have to have detached structures. In the Residence 3 district, which is our multifamily district, which includes 1 and 2 unit homes by right, they would be allowed to do 1 and 2 unit homes. If this was a district that was single family only, it would only be single family districts, single family buildings. The buildings themselves have to be a maximum footprint of 1,200 square feet. They're required to be smaller than we would otherwise allow. In the R3, they're limited all at 1,200 square feet. The sizes for these little blue example buildings are all taken from 1,200 square foot footprint buildings in the neighborhood. Interestingly, one is a 3-family, one's a 2-family, and one's a 1-family. Then we have some design standards around the courtyard cluster. So the driveways and garages have to be consolidated. They can't be between the homes and the courtyard, and they have to be screened from the neighbors. I'm going to turn things back to James to go through some of the last few key features, and then we're going to turn into an hour of questions.
All right. Everyone's still with us, yeah? Excellent. All right, so as I mentioned before, the zoning ordinance includes requirements and standards around parking. So amongst the changes that are proposed in this first draft include increased bicycle parking requirements, a reduction in the automobile minimum requirements, and the addition of maximum requirements for automobile parking. The ordinance also proposes allowing sharing of underutilized parking between uses on a site or even between parcels in some circumstances. And then also allows or introduces the idea of transportation demand management as a base requirement. Now, transportation demand management is something that the city has been imposing on development projects as part of many, many special permits, but in this case, we're standardizing the practice and making it a base requirement for all projects over some certain size. I was about to. I'm already there. So transportation demand management is a series of operational practices on a site or design features of the site that discourage the use of single occupant vehicles and encourage the use of multi-modes of transportation. So it can include everything from showers on site, so it's easy to walk or bike to a facility, to preferred parking for various alternative modes, to payments, direct payments to employees who use transit or bike, etc. So it's a wide range of things, but by including it in as a base requirement, it becomes standardized for all development projects. The ordinance also includes a number of sustainable building design requirements and incentives. This portion of the first draft we feel is kind of not entirely complete yet. We're looking to, there's currently a climate action planning process going on with the city, and we're looking to that process to give us further ideas to incorporate into the draft ordinance. We're also looking at some specific requirements around arts and cultural uses and requirements, including one idea that projects over a certain size would actually be required to include some form of artistic feature or cultural facility. Development review is a significant part of the ordinance. What we're proposing at this point in time in the first draft is that the development review process, there should be a relationship between the scale and significance of a given project and the review process that project goes through. So currently, all special permits go through the city council. Under the first draft, first off, there'll be more projects that are by right simply by virtue of the fact that the zoning ordinance, there's going to be greater conformity between existing buildings and the zoning ordinance. So many smaller things like additions, many of the things that for single-family homes are kicking them into the special permit process will instead be right. So additions, small changes to homes, etc. The next phase up from that is something we're introducing called site plan approval. This is for projects that are, again, by right projects, but it would require an additional layer of staff-based analysis. Basically, the idea being where there's very clear standards being applied that aren't really of a discretionary nature, but are more more formulaic, less discretionary. They would instead be able to go through a site plan approval process. Another idea we're introducing is something called Section 6 findings. Bear with me, this one's a little technical, but whenever there's a nonconformity on a piece of property, if one is proposing to extend that nonconformity, so for example, if you have a home that is too close to your neighbors, it encroaches into the side setback requirement, you're legally nonconforming on that dimension, and say you were proposing to extend your house back with an addition, that would be an extension of that nonconformity. Right now, that is required to go through a special permit process. We're proposing that instead it would go through the Section 6 findings process with the same standards that are used today, but it would be handled by the ZBA instead. And then finally, we're proposing that those projects that still require a special permit would be split between the planning board and the city council, with the city council being responsible for larger projects that represent greater citywide significance. Right now in the draft, that cutoff is at 20 units and 20,000 square feet of commercial space. But that's something certainly that's subject to discussion. But for the, so projects that require a special permit under 20 units at this point are proposed for the planning board. So next steps. So we're meeting just about, well, twice a month with the Zoning and Planning Committee of the City Council, which is the committee of the City Council that's responsible for reviewing and making a recommendation to the full City Council on the proposed zoning. So we're meeting regularly with them and holding discussions. In February, we're going to be releasing a build-out analysis that's going to compare the potential build-out under the current zoning ordinance and under the first draft ordinance. So we'll be able to compare on things like how many buildings could be built, new buildings could be built under either one of these ordinances. We're also in that build-out analysis going to do what we're calling a teardown vulnerability analysis to attempt to assess which ordinance, well, frankly, whether we've been successful or not in the first draft ordinance in reducing the incentive for teardowns from the current situation. Quarterly, we're meeting with the full City Council for discussions. And on the other side, we're doing these ward-by-ward meetings. As Barney mentioned, this is our 5th one, so we have 3 more to go. Following that, we're going to start doing, by invitation, community group meetings. So if there's a community group that would like to have a more in-depth conversation about some aspect of the zoning ordinance, the entire zoning ordinance, we would set up that meeting. So we're targeting that to begin roughly in the March-April timeframe. And we're also going to, at that point in time, reinstitute office hours, where once or twice a month, we would have a 2 to 3 hour block of time in an afternoon or evening where staff would be available on a drop-in basis for anyone who might want to talk about the zoning ordinance. Of course, we also are easily available on the web. We have a website, zoning redesign, our email, I'm sorry, is zoningredesign@newtonma.gov. Then we have a website at www.newtonma.gov, zoning redesign. On that website, you can find a ton of materials, presentations, our memos to council, a new interactive map where you just type in an address and it tells you what your current zoning is and what your zoning would be under the first draft. Whole range of stuff, an archive of stuff stretching back to 2016 and I suspect even earlier. So tons of material there. And with that, thank you so much. And we are ready for questions. That was quick, so let's start over here.
Yeah, so I believe, I understand that various organizations, city organizations, have been collecting input, questions, and ideas from the public since last summer to drive this process. So the question is, do you have the comments analyzed? Are they available anyplace? And how have they driven the resulting, for instance, draft 2?
Sure. So, boy, we've been collecting comments for a long time, right? Because we did that event series in 2017 in the fall all the way through 2018, where we took on particular specific topics and had conversations. And then this draft was released in October, and we've been getting comments. So we read, listen, hear every comment that we get, and
Are they available? Are they collected? Are they analyzed?
that's an interesting question. I mean, they're analyzed on our end, but I'm not sure that we've collected them in any format. I'd have to find out.
Can you mention any effect that they've had, for instance?
Absolutely. I mean, those comments and that have steered our direction on a variety of different issues. I've struggled because there's so much within this document, so many different pieces.
I can try it.
There we go.
All right. I'm going to try 2 examples.
Yeah.
So one is going back to the event series. When we were doing the event series, we still had our consultant on board from Sasaki. At this point, we're city staff led. One of the things that they showed is they showed a couple of different options on the map, how aggressive to be on changing the map. And the result of the discussions we had said, you know what, don't go that much on terms of change. Let's really focus in on the city as it is today. And that's a direct result of those conversations. Second one, we've been hearing a lot from folks about the size of buildings, the size of the building types, particularly those house sizes. We know those numbers are not done yet. Those numbers are pulled from the data set. We know they're not quite right. We've been hearing from some people who say, you know, those are too big still. Lots of people have been saying that. We also have had people who said, hey, that's way too small. We're not right in the middle yet. We know that. We've got ways to go. But we're continuing to work on that. And part of our build-out analysis is going to help us recalibrate that number so that we're closer to the right spot. And then we're going to ask everybody again, are we closer? Not quite. Does that answer?
That's the issue that I was concerned about. The building size.
And we're not done yet. That's definitely where we are.
You've got the mic you pick.
Yep. This working? No, it's not working.
Hold it down as it is.
There's a power button down the bottom.
Oh, this one. How's that? No? Still no. Bottom line.
All right, who wants to shout?
Yeah. How's that? There we go.
There you
Okay.
go.
Do I need,
Next, right here.
do I need that mic?
of zoning ranges, you know, how does my old MR2 relate to the new proposed MR3? And speaking of proposed, why doesn't this say that it's a draft on it? Because I spent a long time trying to figure out what it is. And this, I got right from your website, it doesn't say draft or first draft or anything. So anyway, so what are the new zoning ordinances? Thanks.
Okay.
New, that's broadly, thumbnail, whatever.
Right, that's a big question. So broadly, so there's 3 primary residential districts: the R1, the R2, and the R3. Residential 1, 2, and 3. And then there's the neighborhood general district, which is our transition district between the residential and the village centers. And then there's the 3 village districts that I cited before. And then there's the non-contextual districts, our public use district, a recreation district, which basically encompasses the golf courses and other recreational facilities. Then there's an additional 5 of these single-purpose districts: an office district representing Wells Ave and other office buildings, a regional retail district representing places like the mall, a non-contextual multifamily district representing condominium towers and such that were built in the latter half of the last century. There's the university, or I'm sorry, campus and institutional district.
So
And what did I miss?
residential.
Right.
What?
I would anticipate that, yes.
So let's do,
How are they different?
so let's talk through Residence 3, because I think that was your question, right?
Please, or, yeah.
It was part of it, right? So the Residence 3 district is primarily 1 and 2 unit. So it allows the House B, the House C, and if someone's got their paper in front of me, you can check me if I missed something. The House B and the House C. House B is our most typical house in Newton. That's that 1,600 square foot footprint that we're showing right now, 2.5 story. Is the 1,600 right? Probably not. Then we have the House C is more like your Cape. Smaller scale, maxes out at 1.5 stories. Then we have the 2 unit. The 2 unit the 2 unit that you'll see if you grab one of the 2 unit sheets, and those are also on the website, the 2 unit maxes out at a footprint of 2,200. But the idea being that a 2 unit goes back to the traditional 2 unit. The traditional 2 unit being about the same size as a single family house, but maybe a smidge bigger, and accommodating 2 units within the same scale, which is the typical that you see in most of the Newton neighborhoods. The 2 units roughly same size as the 1 units. Then we have, in the Residence 3, there's 2 building types that have a proximity rule attached to them. So you've got the apartment house. The apartment house is slightly larger than a 2-family in terms of scale, and can have more than 2 units. So think triple decker. Think slightly larger 3 or 4 unit building. Again, slightly 2,500 square foot is the footprint. Then we have the small multi-use, the small apartment building at 4,200 square foot footprint. That one is more like a double triple decker. So those 2 and the rule. So I think there's questions out there about this one. I was answering a couple in the back. The proximity rules in that are that there have to be 3 of the same exact type within 500 feet in order to build it by right. To build that one by right. So if someone's coming and says, I want to build a triple decker building, they have to say, hey, I've got 3 of those within my neighbors within 500 feet. That requires a more intensive check. That's why it's not in the by right category, it's in the site plan approval category, because we want to do that check and check the work of the person who's making that proposal. We are allowing those by special permit otherwise. That's, again, a question. These are all questions that the City Council is going to be debating. The City Council is ultimately the decision maker on this one, but those are the things. The other thing that you'll see down there is the Courtyard Cluster, which we talked through a little bit. So Courtyard Cluster would be allowed. That's a special permit thing. And then the conversion of a civic building. So in that case, think about a church or a private school that closes a school building. They're looking for something, how they're going to reuse it. They could convert to apartments. That's also a special permit thing. Does that answer?
Rachel, can I chime in a little bit?
Yeah. There's a lot to this.
Want to go over on this side?
So I'm just going to add in, Barney, one quick thing. I
Yeah,
think
go ahead.
in terms of taking, so it sounded like your question is, what is there today, what I'm allowed to today? What is this proposing to do in a nutshell? It's difficult to put it in a nutshell, but one of the things that we're doing is a build-out analysis. So these folks are working on understanding what the city could look like in a build-out of the proposed ordinance, and comparing that to what the city could look like under the current ordinance, and that is upcoming in a couple of months. It's quite a big February. Okay. They're going to be pulling off some long all-nighters. So that's part of what can answer that question for you.
Just as a follow-up, couldn't help noticing that there's a lot more district zone 3 on the north side, in particular, Warwick Road, Northgate, Southgate Park, as well as the wider expanse away from Washington Street. I'm wondering how that came to be and what's the purpose? How come there's so much zone 3 and could we end up with apartment buildings?
So we drew the district lines based on what was on the ground today. So in each instance, what you'll find in those locations, or you should find in those locations, is a street, like Warwick Street, with a predominance of 2-family homes existing. Now, again, the rule that Rachel described as far as the addition of those multifamilies is only where there's an existing concentration of them, if you will. There has to be at least 3 of them already within 500 feet of the site where you might be proposing to do it before you can be allowed to do it by right. Otherwise, you're in the special permit territory.
Why is that 3 and not 2? How is that?
I'm sorry.
Why did that?
Why is it 3 and not 2?
Why is it 3? Why is it not zone 2 with 2 families?
No, R3 is the two-family district. R1 and R2 are both single-family districts. R3 is the two-family district.
And all 2 families in zone 2 are non.
They would be non-conforming. If it's a two-family in the R2 district, it would continue to be non-conforming. Yeah.
Would that right be if there was the same property?
I'm sorry, there's somebody on the mic.
Thank you. I wonder if you can hear me well, but thank you for the presentation, and taking the time to have this forum for us. I guess my concern is the assumption that we are making these changes and following old structures of the city, because I guess my concern is areas that are already congested are going to be forced into more congestion. Specifically, the Webster Street area, which is already super congested. Having lived in that area for 20 years, it's hard to even get your car out of the driveway. The parking in the streets is almost non-existent. So, being specific for that area, is it possible to build under this new ordinance a 10-story building in that area? Is it possible to have homes that are built with no requirements for parking in that area? I'm afraid that the assumption of building with the similar infrastructure that already exists discriminates against areas of the city that have been traditionally congested and saves areas of the city with higher income.
Well, again, our starting point in this exercise was based on the existing conditions of the city, and the existing locations within the city, and creating a zoning ordinance that was based in those existing standards. So I thank you for the comments. So what that represents is a difference of opinion with that existing context.
Yeah, but that doesn't answer the question. That's the starting point.
Yeah.
Isn't that just code word for, if you're unlucky enough to live in a high-density, high-traffic place, we're going to jam more in there, and that those are code words that say if you're lucky enough to live in a low-density, low-traffic, we're going to zone to protect you. I understand that's where you started, but is that the right place to start? Does that leave us in an unfair place?
So again, the comment is welcome. This is why we're here, to get feedback, to hear these comments, and you're not the first ones to suggest that this is an issue. Yeah, but hold on. I'm sorry, hold on. I want to answer more of the comments that were made. I think also, first off, the areas you described aren't zoned under the first draft for 10-story buildings. The only place in the first draft ordinance where there's a 10-story building is in the Village 3 district, which is in the very center of Newton Corner, and has only been zoned for a location that already has a 10-story building on it.
And it would only be by special.
And it's only by special permit. So what we're proposing is a modest increase in density reflective of the existing patterns of development, because this is an area of the city where you already see those things. I appreciate the comment, and thank you again for making it. The last thing on parking, we are reducing parking requirements, and we are proposing that single-family homes and two-family homes not have a minimum parking requirement. That doesn't eliminate parking from those sites, because people can still choose to put parking on those sites. But what it does say is that if a person chooses not to have a vehicle, they aren't forced to have parking for the vehicle they don't have. So we are trying to be sensitive to the fact that there are changing expectations that people have as to what they need to have on their property.
So future planning?
So, okay. So one of the things you glanced over was the shift from lot size to context. And to me, lot size, equated what you could build. And quite frankly, that puts what our properties are valued at. So there's a fundamental shift from lot size to context. I'm hoping you can explain what that actually means.
Sure. So, as was demonstrated with the case studies we looked at, what we've heard as a concern, as really I think one of the primary concerns from neighborhoods throughout the city, even also from our city council, is the issue of teardowns in the city. And the fact that small houses are being torn down and replaced with bigger houses. And one of the things that drives that activity is the fact that our zoning ordinance is based on lot size. So it basically says that the size of your lot determines the size of your building. And what we're proposing is that the size of buildings within the districts to determine the size of buildings that are allowed to be built in the future. Particularly when you look at the fact that lot size doesn't always equate to the pattern of development. We have, because Newton has topography, it's not flat. Zoning is often set up as a rule for a flat place. But Newton's not flat. It has wetlands, it has slopes, and the result is historically, as lots were being laid out, many lots incorporated wetlands, incorporated steep slopes in strange configurations that create lots with a lot of lot area, like the example again that we showed. Lot has a long tail stretching off into wetlands. What does the fact that that has all that lot area tucked back there in wetlands have to do with the size of the house that can be built up at the front of the lot in the context of those homes around it? There's no reasonable relationship. There is a reasonable relationship between the scale of buildings already within the district and allowing that scale of building to exist in the future. That being said, we're still working on the numbers.
And then you're looking at what the economic impact is.
Absolutely, that's part of the work.
Folks who live in those communities who are counting on that money, when they have a house that, my mother lived in a house, she raised 9 kids, hasn't touched it in 50 years. That's her retirement money. And when you change that, you're taking money out of her pocket. So for the seniors, you gotta look at the economic impact.
That's absolutely right. That's part of the challenge of the balancing act of this type of legislative work. I mean, again, in 1941 and 1951, the zoning ordinance took those rights away from a lot of people who bought, you know, when places in the city were subdivided in the 20s, people frequently came in and they bought one lot, they built a house on it, and then they bought 2 or 3 lots next door to hold in reserve. This is my yard now, but one day I'm gonna sell that lot for my retirement, one day I'm gonna make that lot and build on it for my kids. But in the 40s and 50s, the city made the decision to take those rights away when they made the minimum lot size significantly bigger than the lots available in the city. So that's the kind of thing that happens with zoning, and we have to be careful about that, and that has to be part of the public conversation.
Hi, I had my hand right up. Okay, so I had my hand earlier, but I just want to ask a couple of questions. I think I came to this meeting tonight because I didn't know very much about the zoning plan. Now that I know a little bit more, and I live on Warwick Road, I have tons of questions, and so I think I'm going to put some of them in writing to you, because I think it would be unfair to suck up the airtime tonight. But I just want to say one fundamental thing. I really appreciate this presentation, but you know, it's got to be simplified. I really need to know what current state is, what future state is. All the great points you just brought up about the economic implications. I'm a single mom. I live on Courtyard Road in a single family home. That's my retirement. You know, I've done everything to hold on to that home. And so these implications are really, really important. I don't think I need to stress that to you, but this default to R3, I'm not so sure about that. I have absolutely no problem with, you know, triple deckers, etc. But the fabric of our road and community is so important where I live. So I submit to you 2 measures. Can you give me some metrics for quality of life? Can you give me some metrics for density? And play those out as well as the economic ones for current state and future state. And do you understand what I mean about the density factor as well as quality of life factor? That would be the economic factors.
Great.
And simplifications of current state versus pretend I'm stupid, and you need to just keep it simple for me.
All right, thank you. I thought those were great comments, but I'm not prepared to answer.
That's okay, quality of life, density,
Right.
economic implications, metrics for those, and simple current state, future state.
Right, thank you.
And I'll write the email address up on here that you can type up the more detailed questions.
Okay, that'd be great, thanks.
This should be part of your presentation, before and after. It's not that complex, most of these work residential. You should
So
be able to identify for 1, 2, 3,
Yeah, there was a lot to present tonight. We obviously didn't get to everything. I think we tried to give you a flavor with the case study, so let's keep at the questions.
Thanks. I wanted to ask about a different aspect. Newton is lucky enough to have some historic areas and historic district, and we have a lot of information about that, the ages of houses and which neighborhoods particularly are unusual and give Newton its character. As far as I could tell in the pattern book, you did not do an overlay of age of house, and you didn't particularly highlight that, although your colleagues down the hall have a lot of information about that, but I didn't see that being included on any of those maps. My question is, with the new draft zoning ordinance, can you help us understand whether this would make it easier for developers to tear down historic houses? Are you treating them the same, whatever the age of the house is? It seems like if you can have courtyard clusters and 2 units, that there's encouragement for more density on a given lot. That seems like an incentive for more tear downs, as far as I can tell. And I know we're talking about environmental sustainability, but the least environmentally sustainable thing to do is to put a house into a dumpster. And right now, that's very easy to do. Thank you.
So there is a map in the pattern book that breaks down by periods of time when the city, when buildings in the city were built, but we did not do a specific overlay of ages of houses. I know we have that data. Frankly, age of house doesn't come into zoning. It comes into a range of other tools that we have in the city to protect historic structures, and that's where that activity occurs.
Right, but zoning, it determines the incentives for developers, so it does actually affect.
Absolutely. And so, as I've said, one of our objectives coming into this was to remove the incentives in the existing zoning ordinance for tear down structures, single family, and we're testing that with the build out analysis, which includes this tear down vulnerability analysis that we're going to be releasing next month. The courtyard clusters, it's important to remember that the existing zoning ordinance already allows some of the things that we included. It doesn't allow courtyard clusters, but it does allow townhouses. And we're replacing those things, so we're no longer allowing townhouses in the majority of the residential districts. They'll only be allowed in neighborhood general. And those are always by special permit. I think one of the other important things to note about the special permits under this new ordinance is that right now we have a very kind of wide and loose set of criteria that govern whether a special permit is granted or not. In the proposed first draft ordinance, for every single place where a special permit requirement is proposed, there are specific criteria that are looked at, which we think will change the nature of that special permit review process. Yep.
So I want to add on, because you had some questions about incentives for historic preservation versus tear down. We are trying to build in tools that encourage preservation where we can. And again, it's limited. There are limited places where it works. But we've had folks who've brought other ideas to us, and we're considering them too. But one of those is in that courtyard cluster, you're allowed to keep, there's an incentive to keep the house if there's a house on the site. So normally the courtyard cluster has a limit on what size you can do, and it says, okay, if you're gonna do a courtyard cluster and you have that oddly large lot for the district, we'd rather you keep the house and then do a few units with it. We're looking at a couple of other ones. The conversion, again, we talked about with conversion of a civic structure like a school or a church. We are looking at in the R1 district that a House A, which is our largest building type, our largest single residence house type, could be split, again, by special permit with criteria. So that, again, trying to encourage that if you do have that particularly large stately home, that it be preserved and that there's a couple of different economic choices that are available to that owner.
I've got the mic. A couple of things. So much to talk about here. There are a lot of old ratty buildings in the city, I've got to say. I've looked to buy, I've been in those houses. The ones that I can afford are often falling apart. There's asbestos on the pipes, there's vinyl asbestos in the floor tile, there's single glazed windows, there's a lot of rot. I get that old buildings have character and give a neighborhood its personality. I would love to see some way of incentivizing or grants for preserving, because to ask a homeowner to keep their building when someone is trying to get them to tear it down kind of puts them in a real bind. So I just want to put that out there. Is how can we protect the housing stock that we have and help people do what they need to do? My particular concern also, and maybe I missed this, that's point one. Point two, you're allowed to do something if there are 3 similar buildings within 500 feet. That sounds kind of crazy to me. I mean, there's a lot of diversity in the city, and there are places where you don't have something, and maybe I missed part of that, but I just want to question that. 500 feet is random. Maybe there's 2 buildings nearby that are kind of like that, or maybe there's one, but it's really cool, and shouldn't you be able to kind of pick up on some of what's going on in that building? So there's that. My concern is, senior-friendly issues, and when people want to put a living space on the first floor, maybe it's a 2-family and they're townhouses and this 2,000 square foot limit, kind of you're bumping up against that. I know it sounds generous, but I know houses that are like this. So maybe there can be some additional ways of expediting approvals if people are doing a good job of creating a living unit on the first floor and doing things that make a house more senior friendly. Thank you.
So I think that on that last point, that's one of the tensions we have in this always is going to be reasonable expansion versus the teardown question. And fine-tuning these numbers is really kind of key to that. And there are tools that we're looking into that might be complement the building footprint option. So that is something we are looking at, is how do we fine-tune this, because the reasonable expansion to be able to create a ground floor space when someone needs that is paired against that tear down question, and then that's really this tension that we're all wrestling with.
I have a question about uses in R1 and R2. In a lot of areas, there's a lot of encroachment now of commercial uses sliding into R1 and R2 zones. And I'm wondering, what are we looking at doing in terms of changing allowable uses in R1 and R2?
So the R1 and R2 districts are both single-family districts. They differentiate in the building types that are allowed. The uses are pretty strictly residential. There's just a couple exceptions in that. One is, of course, that accessory home businesses and such are always allowed. The other thing that we're proposing is that bed and breakfasts be allowed in Newton. For those who didn't know that, they're not currently allowed in the city. And I apologize to the numerous ones that we already have. And then by special permit, we're proposing to allow some use conversions to allow a limited range of non-residential uses into an existing building. There's a I'm not going to get into it, but there's a section that lists the criteria that is attached to that, but there's a pretty extensive criteria, not the least of which is that you can't build a new building to accommodate a new use. It has to be an existing building. And then there's a range of criteria around ensuring that it's compatible with the surrounding area and that it's not in an inappropriate location. But we are introducing a little bit of flexibility in use under a very limited range of, with a very limiting range of controls.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. One is, you made some comment earlier that I'm curious to know how much we feel the city should increase in size. So we currently have about 85,000 residents. And you made some comment about, you made it sound like you were looking at increasing the density somewhat, so that in my mind made me think that there is a goal that has been an accepted perception that we should be growing rather than maintaining. Now, I know there's been quite a bit of discussion around growing at the city centers, but what about the residential and neighborhood centers beyond the city centers? And is the goal to grow those, or is the goal to kind of maintain the rearrange the what so people can build within without having to ask for permission all the time?
Right. So it's an interesting question. From the perspective of this zoning ordinance effort, this is really about how do we diversify the housing choices and options that people have? How do we introduce a degree of more flexibility but not going overboard on it? That's really the focus of this zoning redesign effort. As I said before, the idea of thinking about significant change, thinking about areas where there would be major changes to what's allowed or what's there, that's something that we're leaving for future planning efforts, for future master planning and future changes to the zoning ordinance. This one is really trying to stick with existing, but diversifying housing choices and creating some flexibility.
I think by now you probably realize that a lot of people in this area are very sensitive about these changes. We live as someone said, in a dense area, and we're very concerned that you're going to make it more dense. I noticed in your Ward 6 presentation you had a chart that you gave out that identified each one of the new zones and showed what could be done and how big the houses could be and all that information. But I don't see it here over in Ward 3, and I wonder if you've run out or if there's a way that people can get that, because it was very helpful explanation of what was going on.
Absolutely. So they are available on our website. Unfortunately, we failed to print them for this meeting.
It's just another incident where people feel they're being discriminated against because.
No, sorry, it was my fault. I forgot to print the charts. They're available on our website. You can come by City Hall tomorrow.
You need an 11 by 17.
What is the chart called on the website so we can find it?
That's the website right there.
What is the chart called?
This is what he wants. This one.
What is the name of it?
It's the comparison table.
If you also leave your email for me, I can email it to you directly tomorrow. So it's basically
It's an 11 by 17 chart that identifies all the residential zones and all of the commercial zones and says what can be done in it and how big the houses can be and how big the buildings can be. It gives all that information. It's really very, very
The at a
helpful.
glance look at everything, and we apologize, we did forget to print it. It was also, Ward 6 was the first night we had it ready, so the other wards also haven't had it in person. So again, apologies, it's not here.
But it's the same information, it's just a summary sheet.
Anyway, we'd like to get some over here on the north side of the city.
We will have
I
it
noticed in your
I
zoning.
appreciate your expectation about perfection now. Our reputation precedes us.
In the zoning plan, you've got some spots in West Newton where there's a single lot zoned differently than the land all around it.
Yep.
And I know that it's a conscious decision on your part, but I say that I think that could be termed spot zoning. And it might be better to try and incorporate those individual lots into some lot beside it. For example, in 505 Waltham Street, you've got it zoned as Village General, and it's the only lot in, within some distance that has that zone.
Thank you. So we'll take a look at that, but I will note that the ordinance has been reviewed by both our internal law department as well as external legal consultants. But thank you for that.
Okay, and I'd like to point out to you that in Newton Corner, that 7-story building that you keep referring to, Newton had no control over the construction of that building.
Yep.
It was built by the Turnpike, and it was a result of that they made an agreement with the city that they would try and follow zoning and building any of their air rights. So I don't think it's something that was part of the city plan. It was a sales pitch from the Turnpike Authority. There were a number of other issues, but I did send you a long written memorandum. I gave it to Bill. Okay, so you know all my comments. Thank you.
Gentlemen, for waiting over here.
Thank you. First house I owned was in Somerville. 4-foot setbacks, almost impossible to park. Moved to Newton. No 4-foot setbacks, and there was parking. I noticed in your presentation that there's a change. There's no minimum parking requirements, and there are going to be maximum parking requirements. What that tells me is that as the new area is developed, it's going to be, the housing is going to be developed without parking, because the developer is going to be able to build larger property, larger buildings, because they don't have to worry about the parking space. The question I have is, since it's I think everybody sitting around would agree, everybody in Newton comes to Newton with a car or two. I don't think anybody came here on a bicycle today, and I don't think anybody will be riding a bicycle to work until late spring. So the idea that we're going to become something other than what we are, which is a community that does rely on cars, is being written out of this plan, and I just don't know what the philosophy is behind that.
Sure. So first off, that wasn't 100% accurate. So first off, we are not eliminating minimum parking requirements universally. We're saying that single and two-family homes would not have a minimum parking requirement. Second off, though, I will note that communities all across the country are eliminating minimum parking requirements, and it's not resulting in developers not building parking, but it is leaving that parking decision more to a market-based approach. Most developers will tell you that they cannot get financing if they don't provide parking. Banks have more control over parking, frankly, than we do.
Just to add, the application is more than just the residential districts too. We have in Newton examples of oceans of parking that are built that degrade the environment, and I think we're trying to get at that issue as well, so that we don't get these really large surface parking lots where you don't see cars except one day a year, on the day before Thanksgiving. So it's a delicate balance. I understand what you're saying.
Where are those lots?
So, James, you want to take that one as to where they are?
Sure. The Chestnut Hill Mall did a study and determined that they had, on their busiest shopping day, at the busiest hour of their busiest shopping day, they had 900 vacant parking spaces. I understand that we're talking about West Newton.
So, as everybody else has been saying as well, I think density is the biggest concern here. I don't understand the theory that if there are 3 conforming or similar uses within 500 feet, then everything else can become that way. So, we live on Adela Avenue. We live on a street that's got predominantly single-family homes, but quite a few two-families. Everybody gets along, we're all friends, it's a great community. On our street, every one of those houses that are single-family could be turned into two families. That changes the tenor of the street, it makes more traffic. I don't know, where do you think these kids are going to be going to school? This theory that just because there's 3 others means you can do it all over, it's gonna make not just more dense, but it's going to change what our community is like. And I'm the other half of the person that moved from Somerville. We left Somerville for a reason. We came to, not suburbia, because West Newton, frankly, we thought was the perfect combination of both. But what you're trying to do, it seems like in these ordinances, is make at West Newton, not Newton Center, not the south side, but you're trying to make our area of Somerville. It's going to increase the revenue for the taxes in the city, but it's going to do it on the backs of everybody in this room. That doesn't seem fair.
Yeah, I'd like to build on some of the points that people in the back have said about how this will affect their property values and their property rights. And, you know, it seems to me that we all understood, we had a certain number of assumptions that we had when we bought our homes, about what we can do, about what our neighbors can do. And we shouldn't just take those away willy-nilly. And, you know, so it seems like, you know, we're taking away FAR and replacing it with these housing types. That seems to be one of the big differences that's going on. And I actually spent an entire Saturday reading over the report, and I'm still confused about how it affects my property, and I don't think most people have done that much research. So it seems to me that there's a tremendous value of keeping things, the system, the way it is, and making incremental changes. So if we do find that there are teardowns, well then let's have some specific things to talk about teardowns. If we think that there are some houses that are out of context with their neighbors, let's do that. But just throwing out everything, or a lot, of what we all had assumed was going to happen in our neighborhoods, and making completely different changes that we don't understand. I guess I don't understand why we need to do that. I don't see what the big problem is that we're trying to solve.
Oh, are you going to answer or no?
Was there a question there?
So I appreciate the comment again. So our marching orders, of course, come from the city council. This is
Right now, they come from the mayor.
I'm not doing this to you. Our marching orders came from the city council. I can say that we've worked very, very hard on these issues, and what it is a very large range of issues. The fact of the matter is, FAR was introduced a number of years ago. It was updated in 2011 to try and deal with the teardown issue. There's been virtually no change in the teardown issue as a result of that. FAR is not a terribly good tool for dealing with the teardown issue. We believe the approach that we're proposing is a good way of dealing with the teardown issue.
No, it isn't.
But it requires a different way of thinking about
footprints.
zoning and the approach. But the marching orders really were that our current zoning ordinance was not producing outcomes that were satisfactory to the community and weren't meeting the expectations of the city council on a range of issues, from environmental issues to housing issues to economic development issues, and that the best course of action for moving forward was a wholesale review and rewrite of the zoning ordinance, which we've been engaged in. We had hoped, we do hope that this ordinance is actually easier to use in practice. That's some of the early feedback we've had, but I'm happy to hear your comments and test it out. I found FAR is actually something most people don't understand, particularly when you get into the details of what counts in your basement, what counts in your attic, and how that results in houses sitting up on pedestals so that they can count more of their area as basement, and how that results in flatter roofs so that area isn't getting lost in attics that can be instead added to the living area, the counted living area space. So FAR has had a lot of unintended consequences, I guess is the short answer to what I'm saying. That
in some sense it's the devil we know,
everything does.
versus the devil we don't know.
Right, and one of the things we want to explore is how well do we know this devil? And so that's one of the things we'll get out of the build-out analysis.
So, kind of following up on that, I have one comment and two questions. So the way it's written right now, a 4,600 square foot lot would support a 4,000 square foot house. And on this part of Newton, our lots are really small, so it makes it a big tear down. You know, all these houses, these capes and everything else would be torn down and put in a 4,000 square foot house. The next thing is the R3. So by special permit, you can put in an apartment building, small apartment building, by special permit. So what how do you go about that? So on Warwick, a 7,000 square foot lot would support a 12,000 square foot apartment building. So right now there's none on Warwick, but if someone wanted to do it, how would they go about it?
Sure. So there's a couple of questions in there. I'm going to try and remember all of them. If I miss one, you have to let me know. So with Warwick, we are testing this 500 buffer. That's one of the things we're looking at with this build-out analysis is how does this 500 number, which is a starting point, how does it play out? And we're going to find things out from that, and we're going to adjust. If we come back in February and say, we were wrong about that number, that's probably going to happen. There's going to be at least one number where we come back and say, you know what, that number is not right. We know that already. So, we're adjusting those numbers already. We're planning to adjust those numbers, and it's the starting point. I don't believe Warwick, because there isn't one of those in there already, and it is so far, it would only be two-family.
So even by special permit, they wouldn't be?
No, by special permit, there's always an option. But special permit, again, it's going to come with criteria that say how, and I don't remember the specific criteria about that one, but there are very clear criteria for each special permit. How does it relate to the neighborhood? And the idea with those, the specificity of special permit criteria for everything that's a special permit is to give the city council the tools to focus in on what the nature of the question is. So if it's a special permit about parking and trees, they need to know what to be looking for on parking and trees. If it's a special permit about number of units, they need to know what conversation to think through when they're making that decision. Right now, it's a general health, safety, welfare. That doesn't give a lot of direction as to say, I should say yes to this proposal or I should say no to this proposal.
Okay, so now my second part, which I think will be more the February meeting, is these new zoning rules are going to take effect way down the line, but the new zoning rules for West Newton Square are going to be set in stone much sooner. And in those proposed rules are the 10 or 12 story building, 6-story buildings all along Washington Street, which could be up to 100 feet, which is taller than the Unitarian building, which is as tall as this tower here without the spiral. And it's just going to be this huge mass from West Newton all the way down to the Armory. Now, when is that going to be, when can we put comments and when would that be done?
So the draft of that is due in February. So we're waiting for it to. They're working on it, but they are coming back with a full draft of the zoning to match the revised draft of the vision. There was tons of comments on the first draft of the vision. Lily, 2,500 comments? 2,500 comments on the vision. They've been working through all of that and making changes to the draft, and it comes with a draft of the zoning that will match that, and we're going to be taking comments.
Yeah, I think we outlined the meeting on February 27th, was it, Lily? Again, in West Newton to address that specifically. So, other questions?
And Barney?
Yes.
Two more questions and then we'll break up because it's 8:15.
Okay.
Can I be one?
I'd like one clarification, then I have a question. The second draft, the date for the second draft is February 11th?
The second draft of the Washington Street
Okay.
is February 11th. The second draft of the zoning we're targeting for the end of May.
End of May, okay, thanks. And James, you mentioned modest increase in density. Is this something that's going to be evenly applied across the city, or is it really dense areas like ours that are going to be modestly increasing?
So there's a range of tools. So there's a range of tools. There's a range of tools. There's a range of tools. So, and again, this is a first draft. I'm hearing a lot of opinions on this particular thing in this room. Right? So, hang on. Okay. So, there are tools in each district that would allow an option to be multi-unit. In Residence 1, it's that conversion of a House A or a civic building. We're also considering if that needs to include a non-conforming structure. We have structures like very large barns. We have structures like old warehouses that are dotted around our residential community because Newton did not grow in a single wave of pattern. So with those structures that are out of context, we're saying, or particularly large, by special permit, there would be an option to convert to multi-unit. Then, we move into the R3, which is the R3 district. You have this proposed tool with the proximity rule. Maybe that's not the right tool. We don't know yet. We're trying to understand from all the wards what we hear about it. We're talking to the city councilors. We're testing it with the build-up. It might not be quite right. So, with each of the residential districts, we have those tools. We also have residential as an option as the land use within the upper stories of buildings in the village centers.
All right, we're going to take 2 more questions from people that haven't asked. So, this gentleman over here.
Hi, a quick question. In your PowerPoint, you showed a new special permit approval process.
Yes.
That had, I'll just talk about it. In your PowerPoint, you had a new approval process for special permits in 4 or 5 stages.
Yeah.
It looks like it's much more streamlined, except that there's a lot less visibility to the community in those approval process. And a lot of the criteria seem to make sense, it also seems that a developer could build any building almost anywhere with a special permit.
So let me be clear. A special permit, no matter who is the decision-making body on a special permit, it always requires a public hearing. Always. It always requires notification of abutting property owners and advertisement in the paper. So that never changes.
Okay, last question. Who hasn't had a question?
Barney, I feel bad because Julia, I
So
offered her the first question.
Okay. I think the camera threw me off there, so I didn't know.
I wish I had 3 hands.
Okay.
Here, I'll hold the camera. And you...
Okay, or the mic, whatever. Okay. Yeah, I'd like to pull together a couple of, is it on?
Yeah,
Sorry.
right up there.
Is it on? Okay. I'm Madonna or somebody. Like to pull together a couple of people's comments. Somebody brought up the 3 of something lets you do something, but you can also do something by special permit, as you pointed out. And under the new zoning proposal, special permits up to 20 units could be done, approved by the Planning and Development Board, appointed by the mayor, appointed by a mayor who wants more development. So that doesn't really limit larger things to where there's 3 of them. And I also appreciate the lady here who figured out that you could build a 4,000 square foot building on a, 4,600 square foot lot. I was looking more, I did my own teardown vulnerability analysis on Larkin Road, which is a sort of plain vanilla neighborhood near me, very consistent, small capes. I took a typical house on a typical lot, Cape now, 7,600 square foot lot, and without the constraint of FAR, but the new constraints of just setbacks, you could build a 4,000 square foot, or actually 3,600, basically 3,600, 3,700 square foot house, much bigger, more than twice as big as what's there. You can build something much bigger almost anywhere, and it seems like you cherry-picked your examples in the presentation for kind of weird lots and unusual circumstances. But if you look at, and I'm not the only one who's done this, you've done it, and a gentleman in Newton Highlands did it, and the 1,600 square foot footprint limit times 2.5 stories gets you a 4,000 square foot house. The setbacks, which are also generally much smaller or equal to or smaller than the current setbacks in comparable zones, don't limit the footprint. So you end up with 4,000 square foot houses in the, basically the R2 zones or just about anywhere. So it seems to have failed the kind of implied promise that zoning redesign would do something about teardowns, which was offered a few years ago when Amy Sangiolo tried to have a moratorium on teardowns to look at zoning, and we heard, oh wait, we'll deal with all this during zoning reform, and it seems to have failed at that. And I can't imagine how you thought a 1,600 square foot footprint would do the job, and that you still need to do a teardown vulnerability analysis to figure out that it isn't, because everyone else seems to have figured it out. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right.
Okay.
So, like I said, first draft, we know we got things wrong. There are things in this that are going to change. This number is one of those. So, how did we get to 1,600? That's probably the question in the back of your head, right?
Good one, yeah.
All right. So, we have an entire database of the city of Newton and the footprints of buildings in the city of Newton. We looked at the footprint sizes in each of the proposed districts, and we looked for how do we get to solve this nonconformity question, right? Because if you're conforming, the rules apply to you in a straight, simple way. If you're not conforming, the predictability goes down. Nonconformity means predictability goes down, flexibility goes up. So we said, let's look at how we can bring that nonconformity number from the 87% nonconformity to 80% conforming. That was our target. So we looked at that for the setback numbers, we looked at that for the building footprint sizes, and that's what generated these numbers. So we looked across the board at the different districts, we broke it into where we thought were the chunks of House A, House B, House C. We looked for what the footprints were, and we got to an 80% conformity with about 1,600 square feet. That's where that number comes from. It's a starting point. We're now in the process of this build-out analysis, and that's why we're looking at, well, what does this mean in terms of the terror and vulnerability? And we're understanding that 4,000 seems to not be the number most of Newton is looking for. We have been looking at this, we've been hearing from a few people who every once in a while say, hey, that 4,000, that's not enough space. That 4,000 includes the garage. That's not enough space for me. So we are trying to understand this push and pull. We're hearing a lot more people at the moment who are saying 1,600 is too big, but we want to give you a sense that that's how we got to the starting point.
To really, really simplify, all of the numbers, the setback numbers, the footprint numbers, all of these came from an analysis of the existing conditions of the city, the existing buildings, and how do we get to 80% conforming rather than 80% non-conforming. This is about trade-offs though, right? And the question for the city councilors are going to be, as we increase the footprint size, as we make these changes and move towards greater degrees of non-conformity, there's trade-offs that come with that. Increased costs for homeowners who want to make changes, lower, the property value question that's already been cited. So there's trade-offs. So by starting with existing conditions, we could then engender a public conversation around these trade-offs. And that's what we're doing, I think, successfully tonight. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
I hope it stopped raining. Thank you. Have a great evening.
We're going to be here for a while.
Just in time as my battery gets low. Finish.